welcome to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide, here today with David Buchs, and we're going to be talking about, what do you want to call it, David? Lectio Continua preaching on whole books, whatever you want to call it, right?
Midweek specials.
Midweek specials, I love it. No, it should be a good time, but it would be remiss of me to not ask, how is the weather out in your part of the world right now?
It's a transitional time in central Minnesota. We had some snow on Sunday. We've had an unseasonably cold spring, but now we've got a forecast of 70 degrees this Sunday. It's raining today, so I expect by next week things are going to be green, and that's great. It's just a wonderful time. Things are beginning anew, and there's lots of work to do. So it's good.
Well, there's indeed a lot of work to do. I promise I'm not trying to one-up you here with this by any means, but my experience of late has been kind of wild. North Dakota, I don't know if our listeners pay attention to the Weather Channel or not. North Dakota had a major snowstorm during Holy Week. Some parts of this state received upwards of 2 to 3 feet of snow on like Holy Tuesday, Holy Wednesday, something like that. Personally, around here, we got 1.5 feet, and it's not gone yet. So we also had snow on Easter Sunday itself. Got a couple inches early in the morning, and I think we're even predicted to get another snowstorm this coming weekend. So things are just kind of nuts right now in North Dakota.
Yeah, one upping would have been like, oh, we got snow on Easter Monday. But this is like, this is sit down and be quiet, little boy. That's what you just said to me.
And again, I'm not trying to like compare anything here. It's just this is what's happening right now in North Dakota. It's kind of nuts.
It's just how it is. Yeah.
So it has been a little bit difficult for the ranchers, especially because this is, of course, calving season. And I know that there's been ranchers who have probably lost calves already because of it. But on the other hand, we desperately needed the amount of moisture that we're going to get out of this. So there is something to be said for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is something helpful, to remember last year. That's always very valuable. But then also to think, sometimes things don't work as well as they should, or things get pushed back. Planting gets pushed back. The emergence of pasture gets pushed back, but it's still, there's still the summer ahead. And so God provides. It'll be good.
Exactly. Well, and I do remember, too, one of the members around here mentioned there was a similar snowstorm about the same time of year 25 years ago. And I like to point out that, God brought you through that.
Right.
He's going to bring you through this one, too. All good stuff. But we're here today to talk about a different style of preaching than perhaps as we're used to in Lutheran circles, especially. I'm not saying it's unknown, but we do typically gravitate towards more, lectionary type preaching, that sort of thing. But what do we mean, David, when we talk about something like Lectio Continua? What does it mean, and what does that kind of preaching look like?
Yeah, it's the use of the word continua there says what it means. It's continuous from one pericope to the next. So taking a book, any book of the Bible, really, and starting at the beginning and working your way through to the end. In I suppose greater or smaller chunks. For me, it ends up being often less than a chapter at a time. A portion, a third, maybe of a chapter at a time. What's depending on what's digestible, but you preach 1 week on one section and then move on to the next week.
Sure. And you say that, in your experience, so, you preach this way. Can you talk about your own experience with that?
Yeah. So just this last fall, starting in September, we have had historically a midweek Wednesday evening service here at our church, which was designed originally to serve folks who might be away on the weekend. But I was interested in doing something a little bit different rather than simply repeating what I'd done on Sunday morning. And so I began this fall with the Book of Philippians. Started in September on Wednesday evenings with Philippians. And I spent, it probably was the next 2 or maybe 2.5 up until Advent, preaching through the Book of Philippians on Wednesday evenings.
How many sermons did that end up being, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, it was probably 8 or 9, I think, something like 9? That. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's good. That's good. I know I also personally have been preaching this way for a while with our midweek services. We actually started a midweek service here, partly in connection with confirmation, the hope being that kids would be able to attend that as well. But it ended up just being kind of a general thing that we've continued year round. And we we get our usual Wednesday crowd, and it's a pretty good feeling. But I have also preached through some whole books, like I've preached through First Peter, I've preached through First Thessalonians. I'm trying to remember some of the other ones that I've done so far. Jonah was one of them, I'm pretty sure. We also went through another one of the minor prophets, Malachi. That's what it was. Yeah, the Book of Malachi. I mean, what would you say that your experience is with it in general? I mean, what kind of things do you get out of it?
So it's incredibly rewarding, even if only for my own personal study, right? So to take the book of Philippians, for instance, and to extend the study of it over a long period of time. I mean, it kind of in the way that you might think about it as preparing for a Bible study, but there's a different sort of timbre when you're preparing to preach, because for each pericope, you're thinking about the sense of it and the application of it and how to, encapsulate it in really, a shorter period of time and in less discursive style than I do in a Bible study. So to kind of to think that through for a book of the Bible has been really productive and has been helpful in kind of providing depth to my understanding of the texts. I think that for folks who attend the services, at least this is what the benefit I would find if I was sitting in the congregation is the continuity from one week to the next. So, usually the preaching consists of, well, kind of this is what I said last week, or this is what we've covered so far, and here's where we're picking up again, and here's how the argument or the train of thought progresses. So there's this expectation, this looking forward to what I'm going to hear next from Paul on this subject, or whoever it might be.
Sure. Well, and I think it's especially helpful too by having a different sermon like this, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but having this continual kind of exposition of a book or something like that, it is also helpful because it gives the whole congregation another opportunity to have another worship service, right? It's not that I'm hearing Sunday all over again, I'm hearing something new.
Right. And I was going to ask you, you said you kind of have your usual Wednesday crowd. Do you find that you have a mixture of people who have come on Sunday and come again on Wednesday, folks who are only there on Wednesday? How does that composition look for you?
I have a few that are kind of my Wednesday only, but I think that might be work related or something. But I would say at least 3/4, if not more, of the Wednesday crowd also regularly attend on Sunday. So they're coming twice a week, which I think is great. Is that your experience too?
It has been my experience too, and I am so thankful for it. I mean, the fact that there are people who want to hear God's word with twice the frequency of what we would normally ask of parishioners is just like, I mean, what a marvel! And it's just wonderful. It makes it a delight and not a chore by any stretch of the imagination. To show up on a Wednesday evening is like, well, great. These people really want to hear God's word.
Absolutely. No, that is a great joy that I have found with this kind of preaching as well. But let's think about it in terms of, let's start with, say, the challenges of this kind of preaching. I mean, you've been preaching this way now for at least a few months. What has been your experience with the struggles that you've had with this kind of preaching? What do you find more difficult about it? What is it? Do you struggle with anything about this way of doing things? Let's word it that way.
So of course, it's different depending on the kind of book that you're preaching on. So I preached on Philippians, and then I spent some time in Malachi, not quite with the same duration. That was for Advent, but then First Thessalonians. And when I'm going through Paul, he's not thinking about things. He's not like dividing things up in chunks with the design that I'm going to preach on them, right? That's not his goal in writing. And so I'm doing something kind of artificial by segmenting it that way. And so there's this risk, this danger that if I don't have enough foresight, I'm going to preach one thing on one pericope, and then the next pericope is going to make that same point, but better than it did in, last week. And I've already burnt all my powder on that one, So it's like, that's one of the risks but it's also a challenge, to keep in view the whole flow of the argument and not lose sight of that, to see where Paul is going or where whoever is going, and to try and track that the whole time and not just be redundant. With Philippians, I was joking with you about this earlier, but with Philippians, it's like, after you've been preaching on it for several weeks, you just get sick of saying the word joy. but then again, like there's this rhetorical point that Paul is kind of compelling you to make, which is like, no, I'm really serious about this joy. And why is it so difficult for you to be joyful? Let's figure this out. So it's both a challenge, but also a great opportunity there.
Yeah, and kind of related to that, one of the things that I found to be rather difficult is to actually know where to make your breaks, like, where to create your own pericopes. I recognize with like a lectionary, this is kind of already done, and we just kind of go with what's given, which has its advantages, and we'll talk about that probably in the next segment. But when you are preaching this continua kind of style, this continuous exposition, you have to decide, okay, am I going to actually stop here? Am I going to stop here? And I'll give you an example of this. I'm currently working on the Book of Romans, and probably will be for the next 20 years of my life. I'm kidding. But Romans being one of those books that just takes a while to get through. I probably took far more time than I care to admit deciding where to break, like this week's pericope. Was it going to be at verse 12 of chapter 2, or was it going to be at verse 17? And just trying to figure out, where does this paragraph fit into the argument? Where does it, how does it fit? And if I put it here, what would my sermon be? If I put it here, what would my sermon be? And just kind of trying to decide that those kind of divisions can be very challenging for me. Have you had that similar kind of experience?
Yeah, I mean, I've leaned heavily on, like in my ESV Bible where the paragraphs fall to help me make those decisions. But also I have found a lot of freedom in the fact that, like I can have some overlap, right? So I could preach on these 12 verses this week, and next week I can back up and include the last 6 verses or something like that heading forward. So basically that's a solution to the problem, right? It is a problem. Right. How do you divide this up? This thing that was meant to be taken all in one sitting. I thought about this Lent. I was preaching on prayers of Jesus in the Gospels, and I'm always struck with the Gospel of John, how much it resists division into pericopes. It's like if you're not reading the whole chapter, you're missing something, And so I read the whole chapter for chapter 12 and 13 and 17 on a Wednesday evening, which takes, it's like a passion reading. And that was an interesting kind of an experiment. It's like, that's a long pericope and there's a lot there. The balance is, can people attend to it for that whole time? The great advantage is that if the more text you have, the more you have to work with in preaching, like the easier it is to kind of, you're not hitting the ground running. If you've got a really short pericope, it's like, you got to you drop it in and you're going,
Time to go.
Right. But I think that, I mean, on the one hand, it is, I think it certainly is one of the challenges of the style of preaching. Like you said, you are hesitant to admit how much time you spent on it. I think maybe the tendency is to spend more time on it than is warranted, why not? I mean, I'm speaking to myself right now, but like, why not just crack open the Bible and just start reading and then preach, and
then just go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I know that, sometimes, especially in other denominations and stuff like that, there are people who will preach that way. It's just like, okay, we're going to take this one verse at a time and just kind of go. But one of the things that I've also kind of struggled with this is when you're trying to make those decisions where you're going to divide things, it's like, okay, how specific do I want to be? Because you could break down one verse and talk about the ideas in it and kind of expand on it and really pull in lots of other things. And that's how you might end up preaching on something like Romans for the next 30 years of your life. But how do you balance that with, the desire of the people to, talk about other things too? I mean, so how do you run that balance between too little and too much? That's also a challenge.
Yeah. And I think that is always kind of a lively challenge. I encountered this in Bible study. There's this tension between all of the thoughts that get evoked by a single verse in the text and all the questions that arise, and also the desire to let's move on and get some fresh material going here. And I mean, this is one of the again, the liberties that we have. It's like, if you're not going to stop your Wednesday evening service, you can always preach it next week. There's always next week to say it. And I, that's another thing I've thought about. I've often thought I should be a little bit more deliberate, probably a lot more deliberate in trying to think about the scope of say doctrine that I should be covering in my preaching, as opposed to just being opportunistic based on whatever the text is saying, and I think this might be an opportunity to do that, to say, look, in the book of Philippians, I'm going through here, and here are the doctrines that really are evoked by what Paul is saying. And let me say that of those doctrines, these are the ones that I need to spend the most time on, and let me just be a little bit more deliberate about proportioning that out. That might be one way to resolve the problem. I don't know. It feels like it puts me in too much of a box, but then again, that might be a good thing for me, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe this is a good way of segueing into talking about the benefits of this kind of preaching, because I do find this style of preaching very helpful for approaching topics that are not usually brought up in the lectionary. Even something with like the 3-year lectionary, which purports to be a lot more of the scriptures, and which it is, sure, it still misses things. I mean, when was the last time, for example, you heard a very thoroughgoing sermon on something like predestination?
Right.
Especially in our circles.
Yeah.
You just don't. And I'm not saying that that's, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to make of that. But I mean, preaching in this style gives you an opportunity to broach those kinds of subjects, right?
Yeah. Yep. I thought the same thing. If I'm not mistaken, we don't get any of the divorce texts in the 1-year lectionary, which, so that means that preaching on whatever it is, Epiphany 1 or Epiphany 2 on Ephesians 5, that's our one chance to really hit it, and there's not even explicitly there. So I agree completely. I mean, that is one of the big benefits. Take any of Paul's letters, and you can find an opportunity to talk about the things that we missed the rest of the lectionary, for sure. Yeah.
And you can even get the really wild stuff, right? Like if you were preaching through like 1 Corinthians and have to talk about the baptism of the dead,
yeah.
That's not going to come up in even the 3-year lectionary. So
right. Well, and that's, I mean, think about the benefit there. I mean, it is this great challenge and an opportunity to figure out how to be concise about it. It's one of the professional hazards of being a pastor is that people expect you to talk. And in my case, that means that I just talk around things a lot, and it's very helpful when you're preaching to say, okay, no, I have to get to the point about this. And
right.
if this is the one day that I'm going to talk about this thing, baptizing on behalf of the dead, okay, let me make sure I know exactly what I'm going to say about it,
and have a clear idea in my mind of what right. I, believe this to mean and that sort of thing. So I also think that is also a great benefit. I think you kind of alluded to this earlier, the necessity of being clear when you're preaching in this style. That's been a great benefit for me as well, because it just forces you to think through these things. But I mean, what other benefits might you think are connected with this kind of preaching that you've found in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the benefit of compelling me to keep up my diet of reading and studying, aside from preaching twice a week, which requires much more breathing in than breathing out. Also, sort of thinking continually through one text, you're just gonna run out of steam if you're not constantly being filled. If at some point you're just trying to rely on your own ingenuity, and I've fallen prey to this plenty of times. Where it's like, okay, I know what the text says, and I can just go. I can figure out what to say,
right.
But I haven't adequately prepared. It's embarrassing, and it's not. God's word is better than that. Paul
right.
is better than that, and that it makes that so clear to me. All scripture is written for our instruction, and so that means that there's no little part of this letter that I can just sort of gloss over, this text that I can just gloss over, but I need to give it all the time and the attention that it deserves. And that's really valuable, I think.
No, I would agree. I mean, when it forces you, for example, to deal with the end of the letter and the greetings and stuff like that, you got to think about, what does this mean? And you got to chew on it. You got to think about it. And yeah, there is a great benefit also for the preacher in this kind of preaching.
Yeah.
If nothing else, I do think one of the things about preaching twice a week, what a big thing that it's taught me is to be very focused as well. Because when you only really have a couple of days to really sit down and really solidly think through your sermon, you've really got to be working ahead for one thing.
Yeah.
Which is always a good benefit. And also that it just forces you to think very clearly. Because if you're muddled about it, then your sermon's going to come out muddled. right? But when you're thinking clearly, when you're thinking precisely, that is the time when I really think it can be a great benefit for us as well.
Yep, I agree.
So, all right, with that, we need to go to our first break, so we'll be right back with more Word Fitly Spoken. Welcome back to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide here with David Buchs talking about Lectio Continua preaching. Okay, so David, we left off in the previous section talking about the challenges and the benefits of this kind of preaching and why we do it and our personal experiences with it. But our listeners are probably almost immediately going to have the question, well, how does this compare with, say, Sunday morning and the use of the lectionary? So what do we mean by lectionary preaching, and how do we want to start talking about that part of the discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, with lectionary preaching, you definitely have the sense that you are fitting into a schema that has been that has some design to it that somebody else has designed, and so there's, besides, of course, studying God's word and figuring out what the text is saying, there's also the sense of like, what is this Sunday about? You know, what is this Sunday meant for? And in some cases, that's much clearer than others. Like I mentioned earlier, you know, early in Epiphanies, like this is about marriage. You know, we get the wedding at Cana and Ephesians 5. If you don't say something about marriage, you missed the point, right?
Right.
So there's definitely a sense that somebody else has designed it, and you ought to play along with that design.
And I think this is true whether you use the 1 year or the 3 year. I know that the 3 year has a little bit more of, you could say, a more of continua kind of preaching, like sometimes where one Sunday, especially during the Pentecost season, as they call it, you know, the readings will be one pericope, and then the following week will be, you know, immediately after. So you do get a little bit of this kind of preaching. But even with the 3 year lectionary, you still get this more topical kind of approach to it, because for one thing, it skips and jumps around too, right? It's not like you start in Advent with Matthew 1, and by the time you get to the last Sunday of the church year, you're reading Matthew 28. You know, it's not straight through like that. It does skip around. So what is it about the topical nature of lectionary preaching that would make it? Well, let's just start with, say, the challenges of it. You know, what is the challenge of that style of preaching?
Yeah, I think that doing justice to the texts is often difficult, because although the preacher needs to know the context, right, for the lessons on a given Sunday, you have to know the context. There's this sense in which the context is subordinate to the topic, and so it's very easy to take it out of context, you know, to lose sight of the whole narrative or the whole picture. And so to make sure that the topic doesn't like take on a life of its own, and the way that might look sort of in caricature is that you end up preaching on the topic without even having to reference the text. You're like, okay, you know, again, back to early Epiphany. Oh, it's a sermon about marriage. Forget about Ephesians 5 and John 2. You know, I can just preach about marriage, right?
Right.
Which would be unfortunate, and that I think that happens easily. You know, this is easy to have this happen on like major feast days. You know,
right,
Christmas and Easter, to say I'm going to preach Christmas and not preach the text. You know, it's an easy thing to have happen.
Well, especially since we just came out of Easter, you have like in the one year, for example, you have Job as the Old Testament reading and talking about my Redeemer lives. And if you were to use that as your Easter text, it'd be very easy to kind of start in Job, but end up in, I don't know, Matthew or whatever, to end up in some other text, right?
Right.
Because the theme has carried you away from the text at hand.
Right.
Or if you're preaching on 1 Corinthians 5, which is the epistle reading for Easter in the one year, and talking about let us celebrate the festival with sincerity and truth. You might just immediately say, oh, well, the festival is clearly talking about today, talking about Easter, and so you just kind of pick up on that and run with it, right? So there is this sense in which, the setting of the lectionary, the particular Sunday, the topic of the day, can take on a life of its own and lead you in directions that maybe, I'm not saying they're unwarranted, but maybe it would lead you away from what you have right in front of you, right?
Yeah, and I guess I wouldn't say that necessarily is such a bad thing. I mean, I've had occasions where, to the perplexity of my congregation, I'll read an Old Testament lesson for the Sunday, and then I'll talk about a completely different Old Testament lesson from the pulpit because there's a better Old Testament lesson to go with this gospel than the one that I read from the lectern. And so, obviously, I'm comfortable with that. I think that that's good, and I think that we should be free. I mean, we're free. The whole Scripture is at our disposal. What I'm nervous about is the idea that I can just sort of extract the topics from the Scripture and lose the Scripture. Be a systematic theologian and not a biblical theologian when I'm preaching.
Now, what do you mean? What would be the difference with those? Can you expand
I knew
on
as soon as I said it that I probably was making a making a distinction without a difference. So in my mind, the way that my propensity has been to always want to, in a negative way, to think about doctrines as kind of like these ideals floating out there in the ether, and that you can once you know them, you can access them apart from Scripture. That is a way that we have handled doctrine. It's a way that the catechism gets abused. Like if you can articulate the two natures of Christ, but you don't know where it is in the Scripture or what the Scripture has to say about it, I'm not sure that it's really done you too much good, or I mean, at least it's something deficient about it,
Sure. Well, I mean, it would be like if you'd say, I believe that God created the world. And then you ask, okay, where does the Bible talk about creation? Right. That one's kind of a gimme because we would say like Genesis 1 and 2, but you'd be surprised how many people aren't even aware of that. Right. It's just one of those things where, the doctrine itself can be divorced from the Scriptures that it's drawn from. And that can be not very helpful, I think is the best way of putting that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one. I love the questions that we get in the pastoral care companion examination for prior to communion. The questions which are basically like, how do you know this? Like, how do you know? And of course, if you have your wits about you, you know that the answer is always going to be because the Bible told me so. But then the follow up question is really, I mean, just so fruitful and an invitation to dive into the Scriptures. Like, well, yeah, but where? And how do you know that's what it means and that's what it says? That's what preaching really should do, at least, I mean, to some degree, right? An invitation for people to not just have God's word applied to them, but to learn how to apply the Scriptures to themselves, right?
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. So what other challenges would you see with lectionary style preaching? I mean, are there any? I mean, especially in your own experience, because I know that both of us, even though we do preach this continuous style in the midweeks, we're lectionary preachers on Sunday morning, right? Yeah. So, I mean, what's been your experience with it, especially with its challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there will be times when there's some really pressing matter, some issue that's on people's minds, or something that we've been talking about, and it's so far removed from the lectionary that you can't really you could squeeze it as hard as you wanted to, and you wouldn't get a drop of it out of the lectionary on Sunday morning. And that's a challenge, because I think that it makes it so that sometimes your preaching may feel untimely. Like if you're saying, well, this is what these texts are about, but that's not the thing that's present in people's minds right now, and that's not what we need to be dealing with at the moment. That's one of the challenges, I think.
Sure. Yeah, I know, like, especially if there's been some sort of like local disaster or local tragedy of some kind, and it would be entirely appropriate to talk about these things. If we're persistent in our use of the lectionary, yeah, we will be very often hard pressed to, speak to those things. Unless, like you say, we really press it really hard, or we just kind of abandon the lectionary for that week, which of course is an option too.
You're right. Yeah. I mean, it sounds in some ways like I'm saying that the lectionary is restrictive or burdensome, but I mean, we are free. Like, so it's not meant to be that way. It's not meant to restrain you like that. But.
Sure. Well, let's put some positive spin on this, since we're all about both sides, right?
Yeah, right.
What are the benefits of more lectionary style preaching?
Yeah, I think that not being subject to my own caprice in choosing lessons is really is a good thing for the church, for not just to be up to my whims, and that includes choosing hard texts that we might otherwise want to avoid. That has been really helpful. It's desensitized us, I think, in a good way to hearing things that we might grate at otherwise. Like I think it's really good that without fail we hear wives submit to your husbands every year. I'm stuck on an early Epiphany right now. Sorry,
that's okay.
That we hear that every year is really good for everybody. And likewise with so much else in the lectionary. Nobody gets to say, well, pastor's just on his hobby horse right now, and I don't get to just ride my hobby horse. We instead follow what somebody else has presented to us. So.
Of course, the old joke about the 1 year being that Trinity 9 and the parable of the unjust steward. I mean, would anybody willingly pick that text? You know what I mean?
Yeah, although I mean, now that having been compelled to think about it so carefully, I would. It's such a great text, right?
Fair, I'll give you that. But
I love that parable now. yeah, exactly. Yep.
Because that's always the one that especially like 3-year proponents will come after and say, oh well, you got to preach on that one. It's such a hard text. Like, no, it is a great text to be sure, right. But yeah, it does. I guess you could say compel you, but I don't know if that's the right word. It does move you to consider these things that you wouldn't otherwise do, right?
Yeah, it's a practice of discipline, I think. And I've thought about discipline more generally, and the way that we do things at church, and how following a lectionary disciplines all of us because it subdues our flesh. Like we're going to want to plug our ears to certain parts of God's word, and we're going to want to highlight or amplify other parts, but we're all agreeing together. Nope, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to be disciplined and follow along. So, yeah,
I like it. Well, I mean, okay. So, what would be maybe another benefit of lectionary preaching? Can you think of any others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the design, particularly the 1 year lectionary, I know I'm more familiar with now. I never really thought too much about the design of the 3-year lectionary. I preached it for 5 years, but I didn't ever take the time to ask what's really going on there. In terms of overall structure. But I think that with the 1 year lectionary, you do see a helpful scope of doctrine and topics in the scriptures, right? So it's helpful to know that generally things are not going to be left out. Like we talked about, predestination perhaps being under preached, and maybe that's not so much due to the fact that it's not in the lectionary, but that we just don't do a good job of preaching it, because it does show up in, like, when we're doing the Good Shepherd and my sheep hear my voice, right? Like you can preach about predestination then, and sure. That's helpful about the 1 year lectionary, that it's going to cover maybe not all of the scripture, but it's going to cover a wide range of topics and doctrines that we need to hear.
And the comprehensiveness of it, yeah, is absolutely. And especially because it ends up, especially in the 1 year, having a kind of a catechetical effect to it as well, yeah. Right? That you end up hearing similar topics at similar times of the year in a repeated kind of way, so that we are reminded of, what it is that God's word says. And if some things don't get as much attention as they should, well, that can be remedied. Right. But we at least get the solid basics of what we need, kind of a thing. Well, what about, and I'll ask this of your own personal experience, especially with lectionary preaching, because, we typically have 3 readings. Do you have a habit of combining those readings to kind of talk about, whatever the topic is at hand? So, you pull something from each, or do you have a habit of focusing on just one in particular?
I don't really have a habit. I find that they usually fit together in a way that makes them all accessible in the sermon. But I would say that when I come to the lectionary for a Sunday, it's not always obvious to me from the outset where I'm going to begin, like which reading is going to be the starting place. But then in studying them, it's usually the case that one of those readings really kind of, or a passage or one topic from one of those readings really stands out. And then I mean, it's a fun project to weave them together and see how they support and complement each other.
Sure.
Yeah.
I only ask because this is kind of an ongoing debate between Willie and myself. He's not able to be with us here today, press F for Willie, but Willie likes to weave together like you were suggesting. I tend to focus on one reading in particular. But then again, I don't know if that's just the way I approach things or my personality flaws or fits, or I don't know. Take of it as what you will.
Now, am I correct that you kind of cycle through which reading you focus on from one year to the next, or is there some pattern there?
Yep, I do. I'm in the midst of what I call my epistle year, and I've been exclusively preaching on the epistles on Sunday morning. And that is challenging in itself because that forces me to sit down and really wrestle with the epistle at hand. But I find it to be beneficial because I like to focus on, like I say, the individual reading and really talk about, what does this mean? What is its context? That sort of thing. So make of it what you will.
Have you found that preaching on one of the readings as opposed to the others is more difficult? Like, is the gospel the easiest one to preach on, or is it vary?
That's a great question. I think it depends on the Sunday.
Yeah,
because some texts just kind of write themselves. Especially when you're doing this more topical kind of thing. I think the epistles can be a little bit challenging because, especially in the 1 year, they have a habit of focusing on the exhortation parts of the epistles in question. They have a habit of focusing on be renewed or something like that. And so there is that sense in which you're kind of always focusing on the conclusions of an epistle. And that's challenging in itself. But overall, I find great benefit out of all of them. I really enjoyed my Old Testament year. That was a great year for me. So I like the Old Testament. So there you go. But okay, well then let's take one more question here as we're coming to the end of this segment. How would you compare the two styles of preaching since you do both? I mean, what would you say? Do you prefer one to the other? Do you find one to be harder than the other? I mean, how would you rate them in your own experience?
Yeah. The first thought that comes immediately to mind is when you're doing Lectio Continua, you're sort of like it's ongoing preparation, right? So
right.
There's this great benefit to regularly reading the book as a whole, right? And that's possible with Paul's epistles. So I could read the entirety of Philippians on the regular as I'm preparing. And then it's just like continual preparation.
Right.
Whereas the preparation for a Sunday ends up being much more discrete. Now that I say that, though, I have really been glad for the times that my preaching from one Sunday to the next has been more continual, where like it's easier to draw a connection between the sermon from one Sunday to the sermon the next Sunday. Like we get during the beginning of Lent. We get this nice progression from the temptation of Jesus through the end of Lent, and that progression lends itself to kind of continual preparation. Like in some sense, you have to think about the whole scope of Lent while you're beginning to preach. But that's not always the case with the lectionary, especially during the Pentecost season. It's one here and one there, and much more discreet, right? Yeah,
Trinity's all over the place. Yeah, it's just nuts. And especially as the further along you go in Trinity, the worse it gets, in my opinion. Because like when you get down to say like Trinity 26, which almost never occurs in the regular cycle, you can tell that it just kind of became almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's right. There could be another Sunday here.
But not trying to disparage the Trinity season by any means. It is still God's word. But there is in a sense in which the scheme, it has its strengths, it has its weaknesses. Absolutely. And I know that in my own experience too, like I enjoy both styles of preaching for different reasons. It is nice to be able to get up and to talk about, okay, this is what God's word has to say about this topic, or this is what God's word has to say about this topic, or whatever, or here's how we can really draw something out of this one particular, even isolated passage of Scripture. There is benefit to that. But there is also a great benefit to just being able to say, okay, what is Paul's complete argument in this letter, for example, or what does the whole book of Malachi have to say to us today,
Right.
and not just the little bit that we get here and there in the lectionary, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything else you want to add to that before we go to break?
No, this is good.
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back then with more Word Fitly Spoken. Welcome back to Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide here with David Buchs, talking about preaching, different styles of preaching, midweek services, the whole gambit. So, David, we finished in the previous section talking about, lectionary style preaching. We've talked about lectio continua style preaching, the benefits of both, the challenges of both. Why are we focusing on this topic? Why is this such an important thing to think about? What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's related to one of the questions that came into my mind when I first considered preaching another sermon during the middle of the week. I thought about it, and I discovered that I was, while I was hesitant, I realized, no, this is my job, is to preach. And so, why not preach more? The tasks that pastors might busy themselves with, proclaiming God's word to the open ears of their people, nothing is more important. I mean, nothing even comes close. And so thinking about how we do that and basically how we can do more of that really is a fruitful thing to think through.
Absolutely. Would you say that, how would you relate what we've been talking about to the preaching task itself? We're talking about preaching more, that's one thing, but how does say like lectio continua preaching benefit that preaching task? How does lectionary preaching benefit that task? How do we tie this all together in our calling as preachers? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think, it's a self-consciousness about the fact that our task as pastors is bound up with receiving from God what he says in his word, and then dispensing that to his people, applying that to his people. And so when we think about what that looks like, what kind of a lectionary you're going to use, or what are the texts that you're going to choose, and when are you going to preach, and under what circumstances, those are all the necessary questions that a pastor needs to take up, because he's not for anything else. So, thinking through the lectionary is kind of like the basic, or like what kind of a lectionary you're going to use is the basic question of what is God's word that I'm going to speak on. What is God's word for these people?
Yeah. And would you say, now, okay, let's maybe take up an immediate kind of objection to this, just kind of off the top of my head. Somebody might say, if I'm preaching more, that's going to be a burden or something like that. It's going to be just too much of a drudge. And I really almost to the point of where people kind of dread preaching. What would you say to that sort of a situation? How is what we've talked about answer that sort of a question?
Maybe answer is not the right word for it, but it does reveal our weakness. If I dread preaching, then I'm not sure what I'm doing as a pastor, or if I don't have anything to say, or if I think that God doesn't have anything to say to these people, then my ears are not open, right? So, and that certainly happens. I don't mean to say, just wagging the finger at anybody who's ever felt that way. I certainly have, come up to a text and felt cold and listless about it, and come to a Sunday morning and enter the pulpit and felt like I was, the air is flat. But that's owing to my own frailty, my own weakness, and my own lack of discipline, my own despising of God's word, right? So the solution is basically to care more about God's word. And how do you learn to care more about God's word except by spending more time with God's word? Which is why, the cure for thinking of preaching as a drudgery is to preach,
Right.
and to study God's word, right?
No, absolutely. And then, and again, we're not trying to like come down hard on somebody who's had those, as you call them, flat moments, because we've all experienced them, right? Where it feels like you're flailing around in the pulpit and you're not really accomplishing anything. But those are also the times I find where people really get something out of the sermon. So that's kind of the Holy Spirit's humor, I think. But I mean, just the very idea that, we are preachers. This is what we have been called to do. I mean, God's word itself says, how can they hear unless without someone preaching? How blessed are the feet of those who preach the good news. I mean, there is something central to the task of preaching that we cannot overlook, and we should not overlook. And if anything, we should be encouraging it as much as we can, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that maybe our terminology often gets confused, because the reality is we do a lot of preaching. Any pastor who's doing the ordinary tasks, visiting, counseling, talking with parishioners, teaching Bible study, there's preaching happening. I mean, even in your own home, right? So every father is a preacher to his wife and children. So you're engaged in this task constantly, even with your life. Your conduct is a reflection of God's holy name. And so in some sense, when we are wary about or uncertain or hesitant about like preaching with, scare quotes around it, it's just because we've thought of it as something perhaps too different from what we do all the time and what we should be doing all the time.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I know that when I've struggled with this sort of a thing, when I've had those moments of, I guess you could call it desertion or kind of this spiritual flatness, the way out of it often was to just be in the Word and to really talk through these things and to work and to be where our life comes from. And preaching in that sense, and let's say preaching in the formal sense, like in the pulpit kind of a thing, is just an outgrowth of that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mean, what else do we want to say about the task of preaching itself then? Where do we go from that point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always this tendency to fall into ruts and to feel like you've found habits and patterns that, when you've grown accustomed to them, make you feel like you don't need to work as hard, or that you've made it, or whatever, that you can recycle material, whatever it might be. And I think that the more we can do to avoid those kinds of ruts and not challenge ourselves in the sense of like self-improvement, but really, I mean, challenge ourselves as pastors to take up again and again and again with vigor the task in front of us. That's a really good thing and necessary for us. It's like raising children. I know lots of parents who have thought about raising their children as being kind of a momentary thing, so that there was this time in their life when they were really devoted to parenting their children because there was some challenge or some peculiar thing that they loved about that time in their kid's life, and they just don't think about the rest of the time, or they didn't manage to grow up with their children, right? Like change their parenting, adapt their parenting as their children grew. And all of that is part and parcel of being a pastor, so being a father of these children. And that means constant attentiveness to how you're parenting them, constant attentiveness to how you are addressing them. They're not the same. They don't stay the same. You're not preaching to just kind of a nebulous, faceless crowd. And if you think you are, then there's more work to do in knowing who your people are. But if they're not nameless and faceless, then the task of preaching is ongoing and requires constant adaptation, constant growth. And I mean, to me, I say that and I instantly feel like maybe that sounds too onerous, but then I can't help but get really excited about it because that's exactly what God's word equips us to do. It's like you said, when you're feeling flat, there's the cure is to be in God's word. And it's not a cure like, you've got some infection and you take amoxicillin and it makes your tummy hurt a little bit and then you finally get over it. But it's like, no, I'm hungry and here's a stinking feast. And when you just breathe in the aroma and it strengthens you. And that's the way God's word works. Sorry if that was a little bit too florid of an analogy there, but that's the great gift we've got. I'm speaking autobiographically here, but it's like the times that I've struggled have been the times that I just didn't believe that God meant it when he said his word is truth and that he'd sanctify me with his truth,
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. No, it's not too florid. Don't worry. Well, I mean, even the word itself says, that there are times when we need milk, that there is that time of initial growth when we are still babes. But there is also times when we move on to meat, right? We move on to the solid things, and we need those things too. We can't stay on milk forever. So yeah, there's absolutely that need to adapt ourselves to the needs of the congregation, to be diligent in visiting, that sort of thing, to be diligent in learning where these people are in their spiritual growth. That's all part and parcel of being a pastor, but it all centers on the primary task of proclaiming the word of God.
Right.
That's what we're trying to drive home.
Yeah. And being conscientious about that task, which is, what happens when you think about what texts you're preaching, that's one way at it, or a necessary way at it. Exactly.
Well, in the last part of our episode for today, then, David, let's talk about just having an additional service. This is something that we've both done. We've talked a little bit about the benefits of it already. Can you kind of rehash what those benefits are?
Yeah, I mean, the basic benefit is a greater opportunity for people to hear God's word, an additional opportunity. Anytime people are willing to hear God's word, we should not generally, unless they're being unreasonable, we should not decline to share God's word with them. So that's one thing. I mean, and then there's the benefits for the pastor of disciplining him to do the work that God has given him. And those two benefits alone are enough, I think, to really say that it's something worth considering.
Do you ever feel any regret for having an extra service?
I don't.
On a personal level?
No. I mean, I don't know whether this is cheating or not, but the way that I think about it is I do family devotions with my family, right? So if I wasn't in the pulpit at church at 7:00 on a Wednesday evening, I would be at home preaching to my kids. And so we might as well do it as a congregation, So I actually think about it as kind of continuous with our family life. And when I bring my family over, it doesn't matter if anybody else shows up because they fill a pew. And so it's all good, So I don't regret it. And actually, I'm very thankful that it's there as a fixture in our congregational life.
Sure. Would you say there are any challenges that have been associated with having a midweek service? Just to be perfectly frank.
Yeah. The challenges would be the risk of being unprepared. That's one challenge. And that's a reason not to be innovative in the liturgy at all. I mean, that's a reason to have everything but the preaching be, fixed and certain. Another challenge is, maybe more to do with insecurity, right? So like, what if people don't show up, or like, what if people stop coming? What if they get bored with it, And none of those are real challenges. They're just kind of like facing the risk of anxiety, I guess, that might accompany doing extra work and then not having anybody want to benefit from it.
Sure.
Yeah. Really, those are the main challenges I can think of. I mean, if you want to provide music, that can make an additional challenge. But I have found that people are extraordinarily adaptive. If you don't have your organist and you got somebody who can sing a cappella, who can lead a cappella singing, you're fine. Or you can speak the liturgy. And actually, I mean, this, not to get away from challenges, I think this is one of the great benefits too, is that while I am all for reverence and respect in the liturgy, I think it's very helpful for us to learn that we can worship, have a liturgy, conduct the liturgy, and people can follow along with very little preparation. There doesn't need to be a lot of hoopla for us to gather in the sanctuary and have a fine service, And that's one of the things that you learn when you're doing 2 services a week. It's like, no, we're just going to do the thing and it's going to be good,
It'll be fine. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I know with like my own experience too. Yeah, that anxiety can sometimes be there, and I think that was especially true at the beginning. When you're first getting going with it, and especially if it's new to the congregation, that can always be a challenge. Or if you're trying to adapt something that's already there, and if people kind of have preconceived notions about what it already is, that can be challenging too. But those are certainly things that can be overcome.
Right.
Well, let's ask the question then, why should the pastors among our listeners, why should they consider having this extra service?
I think that they may find that it is well received, that it meets a need that they didn't recognize. For instance, the need that people have to hear God's word more than just once a week, and the desire that they actually have to do that. So that's one of the ways that I've framed the Wednesday evening service. It's nice that people don't feel a compulsion about it, but they know that it's there. And so it's not so much like when we have time, we'll show up, but it's thank goodness we have time because we can go to church, and we want to go to church. So I think that pastors will find that there are people who take advantage of it, who are benefited extraordinarily by it. I think that for any pastor who finds himself saying, I just don't know if I can hack it, you can, because this is what God has called you to do, and it would be good for you and your congregation. I don't want to make promises that are beyond what I can guarantee, but I would say I'm nearly certain that you would find a net benefit from it and not regret it.
Well, even if, let's say, I can pretty much guarantee that, your Wednesday crowd, except maybe in rare circumstances, is probably not going to be the same as your Sunday congregation. Like, generally a midweek service is not going to be as well attended for 100 different reasons, right? Unless, again, there's exceptions. Maybe something would be different in your case. I just can't speak to it. But that's okay too, because even the ones that do come on Wednesday, or even the ones that come on Wednesday only, and that does happen in some cases too, or whatever day of the week that you choose, they're still going to receive that benefit. And Christ has promised to be where 2 or 3 are gathered, right? So even if it's just you and your family and the organist, that's still a congregation.
Yeah.
There is still a great benefit in that too.
Yeah. And there's, this element to leading by example. I find that we have so much to learn. I think there's something about the present state of our culture, what we've lost over the last, 100 years in terms of how we think about education and our heritage and attentiveness to the things that matter, that there's so much we have to learn and so many things that we have forgotten how to do, that the more time we as pastors can spend leading our people by example and just demonstrating for them, this is even the simple things of this is how you pray, and this is how you read God's word. This is how you read it aloud. This is how you think about it. This is how you care for your family with God's word, is by sitting them at the feet of Jesus and having them be attentive to his words. The more we can lead in those by example, the better. Which is why the pastor who's apprehensive, and I'm myself included, who lets his apprehension about nobody showing up get the better of him, is going to have all kinds of trouble because people can perceive that apprehensiveness. And on the other hand, if you just do it, because it's good, people will see that you're doing it because it's good, and they will appreciate that. At least those who appreciate good things, right. they will appreciate that. And that's the great gift that we have from our Savior, is that he doesn't say, look, I want you to persuade everybody, but he says, I want you to keep my word, and I'm going to take care of the rest. and it happens that way. So,
indeed. And one thing that I would maybe suggest to the pastor who would be considering doing this is to actually, preach a different sermon from what you would do on Sunday morning, to actually preach 2 sermons a week. And the reason I say that is because if you just start a midweek service and it ends up being just Sunday part 2, you will get some who will still come. Yes, and that's still beneficial. That's still good. But people might get the notion that, oh, well, I don't need to go to that service. I don't need to be in the Word because I've heard it already.
Yeah.
And I think that can be a kind of a slippery slope to be falling down. You know, there should be an opportunity to hear more of God's Word and, you know, to bring more of the whole counsel of God to the congregation, and especially do it in a way that, you know, would be attractive to more of the congregation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, more obviously useful to them, right? I think that was a big part of when in the fall when I switched from doing a repeat of Sunday morning to preaching through Philippians. I made the point that this is going to be a different service, and people and a different sermon, and the people picked up on that. They paid attention to that fact, and recognized that I wasn't doing something just for people who didn't come to church on Sunday morning, which is what it would feel like. You know, it's
right.
Like, I'm just doing this for you guys who didn't show up. But instead, I'm doing this for everybody. I'm doing this for the whole congregation. So you're all invited to participate in it. And that people are sensitive to that and appreciate it. So,
yeah. No, I think it would be a great benefit for any pastor who would like to consider doing this. But, well, David, is there anything that you want to say in closing before we end the episode for today?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to think through all of these things. You know, there's so much that we do as pastors that is worth pausing and slowing down and reflecting on and being deliberate about. And certainly, you know, how we preach and the occasions we preach is not the least of those things. And so I'm glad we had a chance to talk about it today.
I'm glad to have the conversation. This has been A Word Fitly Spoken. If you like what you heard, check us out, wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or Twitter @wordfitly. I'm Zelwyn Heide here with David Buchs. God love you, and God bless.